Welcome to Folkways, an auditory stroll through the rich and fascinating folklore of Britain and Ireland, the beliefs and culture of people who made this cluster of northerly islands their home, from music to psychogeography to what to do if you notice the devil following you to church. It's a long, strange trip, and there are no guarantees you'll be home in time for dinner. Welcome to our second episode on Midsummer. Burn, baby, burn. This time, let's dive into some of the customs concerning the longest day of the year. From fireside frolics to placing a stocking full of wax under your pillow. So come in from the fields and cease your labour. It's time to get those bonfires blazing again. Enjoy. If you've seen Ari Aster's movie Midsummer, maybe you've already got some of the key themes of this festival down. Fire, love, flowers, dancing, sewing your boyfriend into the inside of a bear and setting him alight. So let's start with fire. Regardless of variants in customs, the element of fire is pretty ubiquitous in midsummer celebrations. Not only does the presence of a bonfire aid any outdoor gathering, but at this time of year, it can be seen as both celebrating the height of summer and also as encouraging the sun, which from the 21st of June onwards now appears to be waning in its power. It's a bit of a double-edged sword, as by celebrating the natural world at its greenest and most glorious, there's the acknowledgement within that there's nowhere further left to go, and a retraction and dying off starts to very slowly start. From deep in humanity's past, such a moment could not but be regarded with anxiety. These days, we might lament the waning light in the darker half of the year, all too aware of its very real effects on our mood. But for our ancestors, winter in Northern Europe posed enormous physical challenges. Food was scarce, it could be hard to stay warm in literally freezing conditions, and there was the understanding not all your loved ones would make it through. At the heart of the midsummer celebration, the fires that blaze throughout Europe represent a reflection of the sun at the peak of its life-giving strength. Yep, it's a celebration, but it's also a prayer too, giving fiery energy back to a soon waning sun, an act of sympathetic magic. But maybe in the balmy heat of June, with the summer holidays still to look forward to, winter is the last thing on your mind. Its arrival, it just doesn't feel that likely. It's a tough one to realise. We're about to begin that downward slope. Perhaps, as this podcast continues, you feel tempted to run out into the garden and start rubbing sticks together to boost our nearest star's morale. You better hurry and pack your bag, as we're now taking a trip around these isles where we'll encounter some evocative accounts of midsummer practices. First off, we're catching the ferry over the sea to Ireland.
But eventually, on St. John's Eve, work is put aside and young and old prepare for the merriment of the great bonfires which are lit in honour of the saint all over the country, like this one near Spansel Hill.
Our first stop is Ireland, where there is a wealth of accounts of midsummer practices, often from travellers passing through who were particularly struck by the fire ceremonies they encountered, and therefore made sure to record their accounts. The Shropshire-born geographer and archaeologist E. Eston Evans writes in Irish Folkways that on the high hills of Ireland, for a long time, the midsummer fires still burnt strongly in country districts. In 1956, he writes,
I saw dozens of them in County Galway on Midsummer's Eve, mostly at country crossroads. Old men in Donegal have told me they remember the time when they had counted from their hilltop fire nearly 100 others.
Whatever you think of the conclusions James Fraser comes to in The Golden Bough, his compiling of folk rites and practices is still certainly noteworthy. In Boulder the Beautiful, The Fire Festivals of Europe, he includes the following accounts.
On Midsummer's Eve, every eminence near which there is habitation blazes with bonfires, and round these they carry numerous torches, shouting and dancing. which affords a beautiful sight. A pleasing prospect to a distant beholder, and a stranger would go near to think the whole country was on fire. They make bonfires and run along the streets and fields with wisps of straw blazing on long poles to purify the air, thinking all the devils, spirits, ghosts and hobgoblins fly abroad this night.
A writer from London's The Gentleman's Magazine, one of the first general interest periodicals, was staying with Irish friends during Midsummer of 1782 and gives this evocative description.
It was to me that we should see, at midnight, the most singular sight in Ireland, which was the lighting of fires in honour of the sun. Accordingly, exact at midnight, the fires began to appear, and taking advantage of a widely extended view, I saw on a radius of 30 miles, all around, the fires burning on every eminence which the country afforded.
In 1867, the Liverpool Mercury just couldn't get enough and ran this feature.
The old pagan fire worship still survives in Ireland, though nominally in honour of St. John. On Sunday night, bonfires were observed throughout nearly every county of Leinster. In Kilkenny, fires blazed on nearly every hillside at intervals of about a mile. There were very many in Queen's County, also in Kildare and Wexford. The effect in the rich sunset appeared to travellers very grand. An eyewitness has described as follows a remarkable ceremony. After the fire, everyone present passed through the remains and children were thrown across the sparkling embers, while a wooden frame of some 8 feet long with a horse's head fixed to one end and a large white sheet thrown over it. This was greeted with loud shouts of "The White Horse!" as it too leapt through the embers before pursuing the people, who ran screaming and laughing in all directions.
On St. John's night, the 23rd of June, the local crossroads was the venue for the bonfire, where neighbours gathered for singing, dancing and storytelling.
Whilst the tradition of lighting bonfires on St. John's Eve has declined substantially over the past century, the tradition is still observed in certain, mainly rural parts of the country today. It's a mixed bag though, an example being the response to a 2015 article in the Irish Journal entitled "Why Will Lots of Bonfires Be Lit Across the Country Tonight?" We see many commenters had never heard of the practice. Some said they'd only become aware of it through visiting other countries, Spain and Portugal in particular, where they reported large celebrations. Many commenters, however, said they had heard of the practice of lighting fires on St. John's Eve and offered the following.
It's still around up here in Donegal. A wee tradition is to wrap spuds up in tinfoil, put them in a biscuit tin and put them straight in the fire. When they come out later, the skin is black, but once you peel that off to inside the spud, Chapers, get the butter out. Known as Bonna Night in Cork, but it is slowly dying out. We have always celebrated in Galway and plan on having a bonfire tonight. A great tradition. Some of my fondest memories from growing up in Mayo are of bonfire night. I remember the whole community used to come together. Never heard of it until I moved to Galway for a while in the early 90s. Standing on a hill outside Athenry, was impressed to see loads of bonfires flickering away in the distance. A relative would always insist on bringing out a small bucket of turf and set fire to it outside his house to mark the night. Come tomorrow, there'll be nothing but scorched grass, burnt wood, and the springs of all those old mattresses.
The rest of these islands follow similar themes, namely that large fire that people would jump over for protection and luck, torchlit processions, and the blessing of houses, fields, and livestock. In Wales, fires were lit from either 3 or 9 different types of wood, and various herbs were thrown into the blaze before young couples would leap over the flames. In the Vale of Glamorgan, a cartwheel wrapped in straw used to be ignited and rolled down a hill. If it kept alight all the way down and blazed for some time, an abundant harvest was expected. In the Isle of Man, fires were lit on the windward side of each cornfield, so the smoke would pass directly over the corn, and blazing torches were carried over the fields. Orkney is one of the places that clung to the old traditions the longest, with celebrations a common practice until the mid-19th century. Here the peats for the fire were provided by those whose horses had suffered disease or been gelded during the year, with the livestock then being led sunwise around the flames. Blazing heather was carried among the cattle to help ensure procreation. And in the preceding century, people were also in the habit of circling their houses and fields with torches. And at one point, no self-respecting English village would be without its midsummer fire, including sometimes a torchlit procession of morrismen and pageants. In Herefordshire and Somerset, fires used to be made in the fields to bless the apples. In Devon, the custom of leaping over the midsummer fire was, as in other parts, observed here too. The bonfires of Midsummer's Eve prevailed all over Cumberland down to the second half of the 18th century. In Northumberland, the fires were lit in the villages and on the tops of the high hills, where people danced around them. Moreover, the villagers used to run with burning brands around their fires and to steal ashes from a neighbour's fire, saying as they did so, "We now have the flower of the wake." We're told that, on Midsummer's Eve, it was the custom of the inhabitants, young and old, of Northumberland village Walton in the Blythe Valley, to collect a large cartload of combustible materials, which were dragged with great rejoicing, a fiddler being seated on the top of the cart, into the village and made into a pile. The people from the surrounding country assembled towards evening, when it was set on fire. Whilst the young danced around it, the elders looked on, smoking their pipes and drinking their beer, until it was consumed. As we've seen, whilst the fires in Ireland lingered on for some time, and in some places still do, in England their disappearance during the 19th century was rapid and ubiquitous. Interestingly, however, Walton, as described above, is still at it. Yup, even today. The village website writes that the Baal fire, as it's called, is a true living relic. As summer fires have come and gone, and in some instances come again, Walton has continued uninterrupted. No longer do farmers look anxiously into the fire for signs of plenty, nor do couples jump through the fire to secure a fruitful union. So why does it happen? Is there some folk memory at work? Or is this a small show of rural pride and of village identity? They continue that the ancient Baal fire shines a light on the character of a tiny community surviving in the 21st century. And then there's Cornwall. Today, in what appears to be a revival of the old custom, fires are still lit the length and breadth of the county, starting at Carnbray near Land's End as the first fire in a large chain, then extending through Sennan, Sancred Beacon, Carngalva and St Agnes Beacon to the Tamar River. A local person of the clergy blesses the fire in Cornish, so be sure to brush up before herbs and flowers are cast into the flames. If this sounds like your jam, visit oldcornwall.net for more information before travelling. Those folks at calendarcustoms.com note in 2017 they visited the Liskeard part of the chain, where at 6:30 the fire was lit at Bolitho Farm, and were made very welcome, they add, later being treated to saffron buns and tea. We'd better get planning our trip for next year. Despite individual expression, there can be little doubt that these customs date from a very remote antiquity indeed. We can think of the many similarities between the celebrations we briefly looked at here, not to mention on this date, past and present, those all throughout Europe. And think back, perhaps you've partaken in some modern summer sun worship yourself.